The summer of 2071 bore down on Wyoming territory like God's own judgment. Dust devils danced across barren fields where crops should have stood tall, mocking the men who'd staked their futures on rain that never came. I seen drought before in my travels west, but this one had teeth, stripping flesh from bone and hope from heart. Ezekiel Ward pulled his hat lower against the sun as he rode the outskirts of Redstone Ridge. 2 years since he'd given sermon. 2 years since fever took his Sarah while he preached of mercy to folks who'd forget his words before supper. The irony wasn't lost on him. Nothing much was these days. The abandoned barn appeared through heat shimmer like some ghost ship on a dust sea. Folks called it cursed after old man Prescott hanged himself from the center beam back in 2068. Zeke didn't hold with such nonsense. Cursed was just another word for forgotten, and he understood that condition better than most. Something caught his eye. Tracks, partially covered by wind-blown soil. A single horse, heavily laden, approaching the barn under cover of darkness, judging by the depth. Zeke's hand moved to the rifle across his saddle. Railroad men had been pressuring ranchers to sell for months now, using methods that wouldn't bear scrutiny in daylight. "Hello, the barn," he called, receiving only wind whistle through weathered boards in answer. The hinges protested as he pushed the door wide, sunlight cutting through darkness in sharp blades. The smell hit him first. Copper and waste, fear. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, the prayer automatic despite his estrangement from its recipient. She lay crumpled against the far wall, wrists bound with rawhide gone stiff with blood. Her face, what remained visible beneath dirt and bruising, struck him with terrible familiarity. Clara Mae Riggins. The girl everyone believed had run off after her father's ranch burned 3 months prior. The girl, some whispered, had set the fire herself. Zeke crossed the space in 4 strides, kneeling beside her. "Miss Riggins? Clara?" Her eyelids fluttered, split lips parted. "Preacher?" The word barely disturbed the air between them. "I ain't that anymore," he muttered, reaching to check her pulse. Thready but present. "Who did this to you, girl?" Her fingers caught his sleeve with surprising strength. "Please, don't lift my skirt." Tears cut clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. That's when Zeke noticed the dark stain spreading beneath her. Blood, fresh enough to glisten in the dusty light. "You're bleeding bad. I need to see where." "No." The word held more force than seemed possible from her broken form. A frontier woman asking a man not to view her underthings would normally command respect. But the widening pool told Zeke this wasn't about propriety. Death hovered close, circling like the buzzards that followed drought. "Forgive me," he said, gently raising the fabric. What he saw emptied his lungs like a punch. Words carved deep into the flesh of her inner thigh, crude but legible. She saw what she shouldn't. The message wasn't just for Clara. It was for anyone who found her. A warning wrapped in butchery. Zeke's hands trembled as he tore strips from his own shirt to bind the wound. Whatever faith he'd lost when Sarah died seemed to sink deeper into some unreachable place inside him. What God permitted such things? What God deserved worship after this? "You're the preacher," Clara whispered, eyes now focused with frightening clarity. "Why ain't you praying?" His bitter laugh surprised them both. "Because prayers are just words, Miss Riggins, and someone's already carved enough words into you." He applied pressure to slow the bleeding. Every press of his fingers against the message, a silent challenge to heavens that remained indifferent. "If you're up there," he muttered through clenched teeth, "you got some explaining to do." Clara's hand found his wrist, her grip stronger than it had any right to be. "Preacher!" The recognition in her eyes stopped him cold. Not just knowing who he was, but something deeper. Something that turned his skin to gooseflesh despite the heat. "I saw them," she whispered. "Council meeting after dark. Gabe Stoker and the others. They killed old Mr. Collings, forged papers for his land." Each word seemed to cost her, but she pressed on. "Then they came for Pa." Names he knew well. Men who sat front row on Sundays, who'd offered somber prayers for Clara's soul after she disappeared. Men who'd called her father foolish for refusing railroad offers. The carved message suddenly crystallized in terrible clarity, both confession and warning. "They'll find out you helped me," she continued, voice fading. "They'll come for both of us now." Zeke lifted Clara as gently as he could, her blood seeping into his shirt. The message carved into her flesh felt like a brand against his arm, a blood testament neither God nor man could ignore. What remained of his faith died in that barn. What replaced it, rising from somewhere older and harder than Scripture, was something the frontier understood better than civilization ever could. Something with teeth as sharp as the drought. Justice. The mountain shack sat lonely as an abandoned promise, tucked between pine and sage, where the Wyoming foothills began their stubborn climb toward heaven. 2 years back, Ezekiel Ward had built it as a place to wrestle with God in private. Now it stood bare as his faith, 4 walls and a roof with nothing inside but necessities, a rough-hewn table, a stone fireplace, a single bed where Clara Mae Riggins now lay, her breathing shallow as summer dust. Zeke worked with grim efficiency, hands moving with muscle memory from tasks once sacred. He boiled water in a blackened pot, crushed pine sap and sage into poultices, and tended wounds with fingers that had once broken communion bread. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd abandoned his calling now playing reluctant healer to a woman abandoned by justice. "Hold fast now," he murmured, cleaning the wound on her thigh. The carved message remained angry and red, but it wasn't the only story written on her flesh. As he worked, Zeke noted older scars, burn marks on her forearm, thin lines across her back that spoke of a lash. Clara Riggins had weathered storms long before witnessing the council's crimes. Nights. He slept on the floor near the door, Winchester across his lap, watching moonlight paint moving shadows across the ground outside, waiting. 3 days in, Clara woke screaming, clawing at invisible hands. "They're coming back. "I'm here," Zeke said, voice steady as a rifle shot. No platitudes, no prayers, just simple human presence. "They aren't." She stared at him, recognition slowly claiming her eyes, then collapsed back onto the thin mattress. "Why help me, preacher? Ain't nothing in it for you but trouble." Zeke stared into the dying embers. "My wife took fever 2 years back. Sarah. I was giving sermon on God's infinite mercy when she passed. Came home to empty cabin and cold hearth. His laugh held no mirth. Couldn't reconcile a merciful God with such suffering. Figured he'd abandoned his post. Reckon I did the same." Clara watched him through fever-bright eyes. "They kept me in old Collings' root cellar after I saw the meeting. 3 months in darkness, hauling me out only to ask what I'd seen." Her fingers traced the hidden wound beneath the blanket. "Last time, they brought that knife." Carved their message while asking questions they already knew answers to. Zeke nodded, moved to the fireplace, and set a pot of broth to warm. While it heated, he settled beside the bed. "When I was a boy back in Missouri, tornado came through our homestead," he said, voice taking on the cadence of remembered fear. "Ma threw me in the root cellar, 5 hours listening to the world tear itself apart overhead." He stirred the broth, not looking at Clara. "Thought I'd never see daylight again." A connection offered without fanfare, understanding without pressing the wound. When the broth cooled enough, Clara tried lifting the spoon, but her hand trembled too fierce. Without comment, Zeke took it from her and fed her, bite by measured bite. 2 broken souls, building unexpected bridge across shared vulnerability. A week passed. Clara's fever broke, and strength returned by stubborn inches. Zeke found her standing one morning, nightshirt hitched up as she examined the raised scarring where the cruel message remained. Her fingertips traced each letter like reading scripture. "Why help me?" she asked again, different now, a challenge rather than question. "Your God abandoned me in that cellar, same as he abandoned you in that empty cabin." Zeke leaned against the doorframe. "My God died with my wife. What's left is just a man who can't abide evil, wearing righteousness like Sunday clothes." Clara lowered her nightshirt. "I saw them drag Collings from his home. He wouldn't sell to the railroad." Next morning, Stoker announced he'd hanged himself. weak from grief over poor crops. Her voice hardened. But I saw them stage it, saw them forging his signature on papers while his body wasn't yet cold. Something settled in Zeke's expression. He crossed to a small box tucked beneath loose floorboards, untouched since he'd moved to this solitary place. From it, he withdrew a white strip of cloth, a minister's collar, yellowed with time. Without ceremony, he tossed it into the fireplace, watching as flames licked hungrily at the symbol. "No more false comfort," he said. "Only truth between us now." Clara watched the collar blacken and curl. A ghost of something crossed her face, not quite hope, but its wilder cousin, determination. "I never thought I'd trust another soul after what they did to me. But watching this fallen preacher burn his collar, I wonder, is it faith I've lost, or just faith in men who use God's name to hide their sins? The words carved in my flesh were meant to silence me forever. Instead, they've given me voice with the one man who might believe me. Is that God's hand, or just desperate chance in a merciless world?" 3 weeks passed like slow-moving clouds across the drought-stricken Wyoming sky. Clara's strength returned by inches, her determination outpacing her healing flesh. The cabin had settled into something resembling routine when Zeke returned from a hunting trip, his face grim as winter stone. "Stoker's men are combing the outlands," he announced, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Claiming they're hunting rustlers, but their eyes ain't fixed on cattle tracks." Clara sat at the rough-hewn table, cleaning Zeke's spare revolver with practiced hands. "They're looking for me." "A dead woman shouldn't cause such fuss," Zeke replied, watching her fingers move over the gun parts with familiar ease. "My father believed daughters should shoot as straight as sons," she explained, noticing his gaze. She reassembled the weapon with swift precision. "Said the frontier don't care what's under your clothes when trouble comes calling." Outside, Zeke set cans along a fallen pine. Clara followed, favoring her injured leg but refusing his offered arm. She steadied herself, raised the revolver, and fired 6 shots in rapid succession. 5 cans tumbled into the dust. "Your father taught well," Zeke conceded, something like respect crossing his weathered features. Clara reloaded, movements economical as any ranch hand. "He taught me other things, too, like how to read men's intentions from a distance." Her eyes fixed on the horizon where dust clouds rose against the merciless blue sky. 3 riders approached from the valley below, their formation tight and purposeful. "They ain't movin' cautious," Zeke observed, hand dropping to his rifle. Clara's face drained of color. "Silas, Boone, Reed." Each name fell from her lips like a stone into still water. "Stoker's men. The ones who—" Her fingers brushed unconsciously against her thigh where the carved message lay hidden beneath rough fabric. "I seen men like Gabe Stoker before in my travels. Always the same story. Smooth gamblers from someplace east, finding frontier towns ripe for plucking." Stoker had climbed from Denver card tables to Redstone Ridge council chambers through marriages to widows who mysteriously joined their first husbands shortly after the vows. His railroad connections and knack for land speculation built him an empire on blood and forged paper, his ambition fueled by contempt for those simple enough to stand in his path. The drought that had choked Wyoming territory for months grew more vicious as July surrendered to August. The creek bed near the cabin lay cracked and barren, forcing Zeke to travel farther each day for water, leaving Clara alone with only the revolver and the ghosts of her memories. "We're vulnerable when we're apart," Clara observed as Zeke prepared for another water journey. "And that creek gone dry might be providence or warning." Her words proved prophetic when her leg wound, which had been healing clean, turned angry red with infection that night. Fever claimed her by morning, her skin burning beneath Zeke's palm. "Needs burning out," he said grimly, heating his hunting knife in the fire until it glowed malevolent orange. "Ain't no other way." Clara bit down on a leather strap as Zeke pressed the heated blade against the festering flesh. Her scream tore through the cabin walls and echoed across the valley like a wounded animal's cry. "I heard such sounds during the war, when doctors worked without mercy to save men who cursed them for the favor. The riders heard it too." By midday, Smoke rose from 3 directions, as Silas and his men set fire to the dry brush surrounding the cabin. The wind carried ash and cinders through cracks in the wooden walls. "They're smoking us out," Clara said, propped against the wall, rifle across her lap despite the fever still claiming her. "Suffocate inside or face them outside." Zeke pulled back his coat, revealing a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. "Got this during my last supply run to Harper's place. Thought I lost whoever took the shot." "You've been bleeding this whole time?" Clara's eyes narrowed with something between anger and concern. "Weren't worth mentioning till now," he replied, checking the ammunition for both rifles. Between preparations, Clara noticed Zeke's Bible resting on a shelf, dust covering its leather binding except where fingers had recently disturbed it. A pressed wildflower marked a page. Curiosity drew her to open it, finding the flower marking a passage about justice. "Thought you'd lost your faith," she said, holding up the flower. Zeke glanced up from his work. "Kept it for kindling. Flowers were pretty." As smoke thickened around them, Clara placed the book on the table between them. "There's more you should know. Stoker isn't just after land. He's forging deeds, murdering owners, then claiming property for the railroad through a shell company that kicks back profits to the council." Zeke's laugh held no humor. "My crisis runs deeper than lost faith, Clara. My sermons praised the progresses Stoker represented. My words supported evil while wearing virtue's clothes." Their eyes met across the table covered with ammunition and maps marked with possible escape routes. Clara reached her hand across the wooden expanse. Zeke's calloused fingers met hers. "Neither of us dies while they still breathe free air," she said, the words more covenant than prayer. The sound of approaching hooves was interrupted by the creak of wagon wheels. Old Tom Harper appeared through the smoke, his livery wagon piled high with hay concealing supplies. "Figured you might need these," the old man said, unloading ammunition, bandages, and food with surprising speed. "Town splitting down the middle. Some folks questioning where ranchers been disappearing to. Others afraid they'll be next if they speak up." Before climbing back onto his wagon, Harper placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Not everyone believes Stoker's lies. Some remember your father as an honest man who wouldn't abandon his land." As Harper's wagon disappeared into the smoke-hazed distance, Clara studied the pattern of the approaching riders through the cabin's single window. "They're using the same formation they used when hunting runaway horses," she observed. "Silas will drive us toward Boone and Reed waiting in the brush." Zeke extinguished the lamp as horses' hooves pounded closer to the cabin. "They expect frightened prey," he said, checking his rifle one final time. "Let's show them predators instead." Clara stood framed in the cabin window, lamplight casting her silhouette against tanned hide curtains. She moved slow and deliberate-like, making sure them approaching riders got a good look at what they figured was wounded prey. Her fingers trembled slightly on the windowsill, not from fear but anticipation. Been carrying their mark too long not to want some reckoning. Outside, Zeke circled wide through scrub brush, keeping low where shadows pooled thick as molasses. "Weren't no moon tonight? Just stars, cold and distant as God's mercy. Just how they needed it. Come on out, Clara girl." Silas's voice carried across the yard, familiar as the nightmares that woke her screaming. "That message we carved ain't one, folks, forget easy. Promise you a quicker end than you gave poor Collings." Wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and horsehair as riders spread out in formation. Zeke struck flint to kindling where he'd laid it earlier, sending flames licking up through dry brush 50 yards east. Fire caught quick in drought-starved grass, creating a wall of light and confusion that split the riders apart. "Fire!" Boone shouted, wheeling his mount. "It's circling behind!" Clara snuffed the lamp with practiced motion, vanishing from the window just as Silas approached the cabin alone, the glow of spreading flames reflecting off his saddle horn. Fool was smiling. Men who believe themselves predators seldom consider they might be prey instead. Boone dismounted at the side of the cabin, moving toward the rear door with pistol drawn. His boot caught something in the darkness, a sound like wet meat being pierced, followed by a howl that'd make wolves cover their ears. He'd found the sharpened stakes Clara had set in the brush, one now buried deep in his thigh. The front door splintered inward as Reed, biggest of Stoker's men, crashed through with both shoulders. His bulk filled the doorframe momentarily before he stepped into blackness, where Clara should have been cowering. Empty room greeted his searching eyes. "Ain't here, Silas," he called, turning toward the back room. Clara emerged from shadow behind the door, skinning knife clutched white-knuckled in her hand. She moved without sound, years of ranch work giving her strength men like Reed never expected from womenfolk. Blade caught moonlight through the broken door before disappearing between his ribs. Silas fired blindly toward the commotion, bullets splintering wood inches from Clara's face. Splinters stung her cheek, drawing blood that mingled with Reed's on her hands. "I've spent months bearing their mark, their ownership of my flesh and fate. Now I hold steel instead of fear, and realize truth carved deeper than their message. I was never meant to be prey." Stoker sent 3 men to kill a woman. Zeke's voice came from darkness behind Silas, rifle barrel glinting in firelight. "That the measure of your courage?" Silas turned slow, hands raising slightly but not surrendering. "Ward. Didn't figure you for this fight." His smile never reached his eyes. "Got papers that'd interest you. Evidence against Stoker that makes me worth more alive than dead." "Like I was worth more alive?" Clara stepped through the broken doorway, blood streaming from the cut on her cheek. She held Boone's pistol steady despite the pain flaring in her leg wound. Behind her, Reed's boots scraped weakly across floorboards. "Clara girl," Silas began, voice honey smooth as when he'd held her down for carving. "You misunderstood what—" Zeke lunged forward as Silas reached for his belt knife. They collided hard, rifle clattering aside as both men went down in dust and firelight. Silas was trail-hardened, fought with the measured violence of a man who'd killed for money and pleasure both. His fist connected with Zeke's jaw, snapping the preacher's head back. But Zeke fought with desperation, born of 2 years' grief and newfound purpose. He absorbed blows like penance, driving forward until his fingers closed around a length of firewood beside the cabin. The sharpened end, prepared for just such need, drove through Silas's chest with a sound like wet leather tearing. "You, maid." "Poor choice, preacher." Silas gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Stoker's already spreading word how Clara murdered Collings, how she turned you against town through witchcraft." Zeke searched the dying man's pockets, finding folded papers that made his blood run cold. "Military telegram," he said, holding it toward Clara. "Cavalry ordered to Redstone Ridge to address Indian uprising. There ain't been Indians this close to town in 3 seasons." Clara said, taking the paper with trembling fingers. "Exactly." Zeke's voice was grim, as new-dug graves. "Stoker's creating ghosts to hunt." Clara's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "It's not just about silencing me anymore. He's erasing everyone who knows truth." The fire Zeke had set spread further, illuminating 3 bodies in dirt that would soon cover them. Overhead, stars continued their cold witness, indifferent to blood spilled or justice served. The reckoning had begun, but the true battle lay ahead in Redstone Ridge. The dead tell tales if you know how to listen. Zeke Ward had that knowledge now, fingers working through Silas's pockets with the methodical patience of a gravedigger. The land deeds came first, signatures so poorly forged they might have been writ by a child with the shakes. Next, from Boone's boot, emerged a leather-bound ledger, pages worn thin at corners from frequent handling. "Sweet Lord above," Zeke whispered, thumbing through columns of figures. Names of the territorial judge, sheriff, and 3 military officers sat beside sums that would buy half the county. "This ain't just Stoker. It's everyone with a badge or title for 50 miles. Clara knelt beside him, candlelight catching the hollow places beneath her cheekbones. "Power calls to power," she said simply. Her fingers worked at Silas's belt, pulling free the knife that had carved words into her flesh. The handle bore notches, small and precise. "Look here." She turned it, revealing crude initials scratched into the bone handle. J.C. for James Collings. T.R. Must be Tom Rollins who disappeared last winter. Her thumb traced each mark like rosary beads. He kept count. By lamplight, they unfolded papers from Silas's saddlebag. A map, corners stained with what might have been coffee or dried blood. X marks, scattered across familiar terrain, each bearing dates and initials matching the knife handle. Graves, Clara said, voice flat as the drought-parched plains. They never left at all. Sunday morning dawned clear and merciless. Summer heat already shimmering above Redstone Ridge when Clara and Zeke rode in. Church bells pealed across the dusty streets, calling sinners to salvation with bronze-tongued promises. Townsfolk dressed in Sunday best flowed toward the white clapboard building where Zeke once delivered sermons on mercy and justice. Now he carried different testament. Horses' hooves struck hollow on the packed dirt as they rode directly to the church steps. Old Harper stood waiting, 3 shopkeepers beside him, faces set hard as winter ground. No words passed between them, just the silent nod of men choosing sides in what was coming. The congregation's hymn faltered as Zeke pushed through doors that once welcomed him as shepherd. Blood stained his shirt, dust coated his boots, and righteous fury burned where faith once lived. At the pulpit stood Gabe Stoker, Bible open before him, words of brotherhood dying on his lips as Zeke strode forward. The ledger hit the pulpit with the sound of judgment. "Found your accounts, Gabe," Zeke said, voice carrying to rafters that had once amplified his sermons. "Seems the price of souls runs cheaper than cattle these days." Clara followed, bandages visible beneath her dress, walking with the stiffness of healing wounds, but the straight spine of purpose. Without hesitation, she lifted her skirt to mid-thigh, revealing the raised red message carved there. "Your counsel's signature," she announced to gasps that swept through the church like prairie fire. "Written in my flesh when words on paper weren't enough." The sheriff rose from his front row seat, hand moving toward his gun, until Harper's wife stepped forward. Telegraph papers clutched in work-worn hands. "Military correspondence," she declared. "Orders for cavalry response to Indian uprising that don't exist." Her voice trembled but held. "Sent under your authorization, Sheriff. To clear land for the railroad." Stoker's face remained composed as he closed the Bible with careful hands. "Brothers and sisters," he began, voice rich with practiced sincerity, "these are troubling accusations from troubled souls. Scripture reminds us that order must prevail. Romans 13 tells us—" His hand slipped beneath his coat, reaching for the hidden derringer. Clara moved like lightning breaking across summer sky, her fingers clamping around his wrist with strength born from weeks of healing and years of ranch work. "You carved your truth into my flesh," she hissed, close enough that only he could hear the tremor beneath her steel. "Now I carve mine into this town's memory." The congregation shifted, divided like cattle sensing storm. Longtime residents moved toward Clara, ranchers and shopkeepers who'd watched neighbors vanish. Railroad men and newcomers backed toward Stoker, wealth and progress their only loyalty. The territorial judge pushed through the church doors, summoned by telegraph sent before dawn. His authoritative entrance faltered at the tableau before him. Clara holding Stoker's wrist, Zeke standing bloodied beside evidence spread across the altar. "What meaning has this disruption?" the judge demanded, initially moving toward Stoker with the confidence of purchased allegiance. Zeke lifted Silas's knife. "Bodies of your enforcers lie in my wagon outside. Along with these." He spread the forged documents across the altar rail, land deeds with signatures of dead men, men buried where your map marks. Clara released Stoker to take the knife. With deliberate movements, she cut the map from the Bible's end pages, holding it toward light streaming through church windows. "Each mark matches a disappeared rancher," she said. "Each grave holds someone who refused your offers." The congregation murmured as understanding spread like floodwater, finding every low place. Stoker lunged then, desperate as cornered wolves always are. The derringer appeared in his hand, aimed at Clara's heart. The report echoed against church walls as Zeke moved between them, taking the bullet meant for her. His body jerked with impact, blood blooming across his shirt as he fell. Clara caught him, easing his descent until they knelt together on the church floor, roles reversed from that first meeting in the abandoned barn. Blood pooled beneath them, soaking into her skirt, and the floorboards that had witnessed countless prayers. The congregation watched as the town's false savior revealed himself a murderer before God and neighbors alike. Zeke's eyes fluttered, focusing on Clara's face, then drifting toward something beyond. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear. "Don't you dare," Clara whispered fiercely, hands pressing against his wound as blood welled between her fingers. "Don't you make me believe in something again just to lose it." 3 months since that blood-soaked Sunday in Redstone Ridge, and autumn lights spilled gold across the Wyoming territory, like the good Lord making amends for summer's cruelty. Clara Mae Riggins stood on the freshly hewn porch of her rebuilt ranch house, one hand resting on the smooth pine railing, while the other absently traced the outline of her thigh where raised flesh still told its story. Rain had finally come in late August, first as tentative drops that sizzled in dust, then as steady downpours that brought green shooting up through cracked earth. Frontier folk called it resurrection weather. Clara reckoned they weren't far wrong. Behind her, Ezekiel Ward moved through the cabin with deliberate steps, his left shoulder still stiff where Stoker's bullet had torn through muscle and lodged against bone. Doc Jenkins said he'd never raise that arm above his head again. Weren't no matter. Zeke found his hands worked just fine for hammering nails and sawing lumber, creating shelter, instead of offering blessings to folks who'd forgotten them before supper. "Coffee's hot," Clara called through the open door, not turning from her contemplation of land that had been ash and bone 3 months prior. What lay between them remained unnamed but understood, like so many things on the frontier. Two broken people, sharing space once marked by blood, now transformed by choice. I've seen such arrangements before in these territories. Sometimes the deepest bonds form where words fear to tread. The creak of floorboards announced Zeke's approach before his voice did. Post rider brought the territorial newspaper. He extended the folded paper, his fingers brushing hers. The headline stood bold. "Land Fraud Conspiracy Ends in Sentencing. Stoker and Officials to Serve 20 Years in Territorial Prison." Clara's fingers drifted to her thigh, to the scar now faded but still legible beneath her skirt. What had been meant as ownership had become something else entirely, a map of journey rather than destination. "Justice comes slow to Wyoming," Zeke observed, "but it comes." When he disappeared back inside, Clara continued reading accounts of testimony that had finally brought down Stoker's empire of stolen deeds and unmarked graves. The paper made no mention of a woman's carved flesh. Some truths weren't meant for public consumption. Zeke returned carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. "Made this while you were healing," he said, offering a small wooden box carved with prairie flowers along its edges. Inside, nestled on faded blue calico, lay an official document bearing territorial seal and judge's signature. "Deed to Riggins land, restored to Clara Mae's name. How'd you manage this?" she whispered. Judge figured returning stolen property was simpler than explaining how it got took in the first place. Zeke's mouth quirked in what passed for his smile these days. "Reckon even law has its practical side." That evening, as shadows lengthened across newly tilled soil waiting for spring planting, Clara found herself pulling Zeke's Bible from the shelf where it had sat, gathering dust. "Would you read something?" she asked, "not as preacher, as the man who carried me from that barn." Zeke took the worn book, thumbing past passages that had once rolled from his tongue like honey. Instead, he turned to the blank page at the back, where he'd written new words in careful script. "Faith lives not in buildings or books, but in hands that help, eyes that see truth, hearts that stand against darkness." The next morning found them standing at the eastern edge of Riggins land, as dawn broke pink and gold over distant mountains. The creek that had run dry during summer's punishment now flowed clear and steady, drawing wild horses that dipped cautious muzzles into water. What was carved to silence became voice instead. Clara said softly, her fingers finding Zeke's as naturally as water finds its course. They stood facing east instead of past, watching as light spread across land, once thought dead but now promising renewal.